Catherine West for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Betts, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this morning. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Bassett Law for securing this timely and important debate, and so many of us have, across this House, shared his concern for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps prescribing, and I myself and others have visited Mr Beheshti, as I'm sure he has, outside the FCDO in King Charles Street. Myself and the member for Enfield Southgate have been to see Mr Beheshti and had lengthy conversations with him, and I know that the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee has led her considerable influence and weight to that debate as well. We also look, of course, in awe at the bravery of the protesters in Iran, led by women and girls following the shocking death of Mahsa Amini, and those women who continue to fight for women, life, freedom, and the right to live their lives as they choose. We look in horror at the brutal repression carried out by the regime against these courageous women, men and children, the breaches of freedom of religion or belief, as the member for Congleton has put on record this morning, the suffering in particular of the Baha'i community, and the crackdown on journalists and freedom of speech online. In response to the protests, state repression has seen Iranian security forces unlawfully firing live ammunition and metal pellets at protesters, killing hundreds of men, women and children and injuring thousands. Thousands more have been arbitrarily detained and unfairly prosecuted solely for peacefully exercising their human rights. Women, LGBTQ+ people and ethnic and religious minorities have continued to be targeted by the regime, suffering discrimination and violence. Enforced disappearances, torture and other ill treatment, including through the deliberate denial of medical care, as has been reported as widespread and systemic. While street protests in Iran have lessened in recent months, the regime's repression continues and state-sponsored brutality has escalated again recently with the execution of 3 more protesters, Majid Kazibi, Saleh Mahishemi and Saeed Yagoubi, sentenced to death in grossly unfair trials, without evidence and amid serious allegations of torture. Their executions are designed to strike fear into the hearts of ordinary Iranian people and to suppress dissent. As members today have mentioned, Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has said, we have underlying concerns that the Iranian authorities continue to have scant regard for international law, with the death penalty applied following judicial proceedings that failed to meet acceptable international standards of fair trial or due process. Indeed, the exact number of executions is unknown due to the lack of government transparency, and sadly, the figure is likely to be much higher. Today, Amnesty International reports that at least 11 people sentenced to death are at grave risk today of execution in connection with protests. We believe the international community has an important role to play, and the UK must stand unequivocally against the death penalty in all circumstances and wherever it's used in the world. I do share concerns raised by human rights groups that the continued use of the death penalty in Iran demonstrates the limits of discreet diplomacy. Therefore, I ask the Minister to outline what assessment he's made of the spate of executions so far this year in Iran, and what concrete action the UK government is currently taking with international partners in response to the execution of 3 more protesters last month, and with a further 11 people at grave risk of execution at the hands of the Iranian regime, what additional diplomatic pressure can be applied to ensure the regime stops this horrific wave of execution. As colleagues know, and as the member for Bassett Law laid out in his opening remarks, Iran poses an increasing military threat at home and abroad. In Ukraine, Iranian-made Shahed drones have played a central role in Russia's illegal war and its attacks on civilian targets in Ukraine. Last week, in response to Russian airstrikes attacking Kyiv, Ukraine introduced sanctions against the Iranian regime to stop Iranian goods transiting through Ukraine and using its airspace, as well as trade, financial and technological sanctions. Is there more that we can do here on sanctions? In the March refresh of the Integrated Review, the UK government restated its aim to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, but there are deep concerns that the failure to restore the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and the stalling of talks in September 2022 may mean Iran soon makes irreversible nuclear progress, rendering previous commitments meaningless. And looking at the Middle East and Iran's role in the region more widely, we continue to be concerned by the regime's support for terror groups and militias, as seen through its threats against Israel and in its continued military involvement in Syria and elsewhere. We've seen other developments in the region too, such as the recent rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and I wonder if the Minister could give a brief outline on his assessment of that development. Here in the UK, since the start of 2022, Iran has been responsible for at least 15 potential threats against British or UK-based individuals perceived as enemies of the regime. In February of this year, Iran International TV was forced to suspend its operation in London after state-backed threats were made against its journalists in a deeply worrying attack on press freedom. And just last week, here in the IPU room, we had the well-known BBC Persian TV presenter Farnaz Ghazizadeh share a platform with myself and others. We heard her speak movingly about her desire to see greater freedom of expression of Iranians and greater safety in the UK for her and her colleagues. Does the Minister believe enough is being done to protect Iranian diaspora members in the UK? I look forward to hearing what the Minister has to say on the wider calls and the reason for this debate, including from the members for Leighton and Wanstead and Denton today, and across the House, and from the Iranian diaspora community to formally proscribe the IRGC as a terrorist organisation, either by using existing terrorism legislation or by creating a new process of prescription for hostile state actors. There must be a way of doing this. As I draw my remarks to a close, Mr. Betts, I'd like to focus on one final area, and something this House has been all too aware of in recent times: Iran's engagement in state hostage-taking, which the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has described as a systematic problem. Today, British dual nationals Morad Tarbaz and Mehran Rauf remain incarcerated in Iran. We look back to the case of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe and her brave husband Richard, and the family more widely, and the community, and the member for Hampstead and Kilburn, who so skillfully brought that case to this House. And of course, the member for Lewisham East in the case of Anousheh Oshuri, and of course, Aras Amiri, who has spoken out just this week about the ordeal she suffered in Evin prison. She wants to see the other political prisoners, women like her, stuck in Evin and freed for good. Last month, the Foreign Secretary told the House that the UK continues to make every effort to support British dual nationals incarcerated in Iran, and that this remains an ongoing piece of work. However, we have to be honest that the Foreign Affairs Select Committee was quite critical of the FCDO and its approach to assisting British citizens incarcerated abroad under false pretences, and has urged the government to go further to strengthen abroad and in Whitehall our deterrence against arbitrary detention of British citizens. What assessment has the Minister made of the competence of the FCDO in this regard? And is it an effective response to widespread human rights abuses of imprisoned British nationals? In conclusion, Mr. Betts, the courage of the Iranian protesters is extraordinary. What we say in this place matters, and we must continue to shine a light on this situation and share our collective revulsion at the regime's human rights violations to spur us on to take brave actions, including the serious consideration of proscribing the IRGC. Thank you, sir.
Right.